first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded so perfectly it almost looked ceremonial, like the kind of document people frame after winning lawsuits or inheriting old money. Except this one carried a bright red stamp across the top that made my stomach drop before I even opened it. The Homeowners Association of Maple Ridge Estates had officially fined me $1 million for ongoing violations, negatively impacting community value and harmony. Bro, hearing something like that would make any normal person think it had to be fake. $1 million over HOA violations sounded like the setup to one of those nightmare stories people swear cannot possibly be real until they live through it themselves. But that was exactly how these people operated. They relied on intimidation, confusion, and the belief that no homeowner would ever have the time or energy to fight back. The craziest part was that my property looked better than half the neighborhood. My lawn was maintained, my house was spotless, and I followed every written rule they had ever mailed out. That was incredible to me because the board members themselves constantly ignored the standards they enforced on everyone else. That's exactly how people act in real life when they get a little authority and nobody challenges them. They stop seeing rules as guidelines and start treating them like personal weapons. At first, I thought this would end with a lawyer, maybe a formal complaint, maybe some embarrassing backtracking from the HOA once they realized they had crossed the line. I had no idea that the next 6 months would completely destroy the entire neighborhood association from the inside out, all because I decided to read every single word in their own rule book more carefully than they ever had themselves. And once I discovered what was hidden in those bylaws, everything changed. 2. When people imagine HOA neighborhoods, they usually picture quiet streets, identical mailboxes, and retirees measuring grass height with rulers, like it's some kind of suburban military operation. Maple Ridge Estates somehow managed to be even worse than that stereotype. The place looked beautiful from the outside. Tree-lined sidewalks, decorative street lamps, tiny parks every few blocks, and expensive homes packed so closely together that everyone basically knew when their neighbor sneezed. But underneath all of that fake perfection was a culture built entirely on control. I moved into Maple Ridge after selling my previous home during the housing boom. The market had gone crazy, and like a lot of people, I thought buying in a highly regulated neighborhood would protect property values long term. That was the pitch they sold everyone. Stability, safety standards. Looking back now, that should have been my first warning sign. Whenever people become obsessed with standards, somebody usually ends up abusing power. At first, everything seemed normal enough. The HOA dues were expensive, but manageable. The welcome packet was absurdly thick, though. Bro, I'm not exaggerating when I say this thing looked like a college textbook. Hundreds of pages of bylaws, amendments, landscaping restrictions, parking regulations, architectural guidelines, holiday decoration timelines, mailbox paint specifications, trash can positioning rules, and even approved curtain color palettes visible from the street. That was incredible to me because who even notices someone's curtains from outside? But apparently these people did. 3. Still, I played along because I didn't want problems. I kept my lawn trimmed. I pressure washed my driveway twice a year. I even submitted approval forms before replacing a cracked fence panel because the HOA handbook demanded written authorization for all visible exterior modifications. That's exactly how these neighborhoods train people over time. You slowly stop questioning whether rules make sense and just start complying automatically because fighting every tiny thing becomes exhausting. The HOA president at the time was a guy named Randall Mercer. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Randall. He drove a black luxury SUV with custom plates that literally said Board 1. That should tell you everything you need to know about his personality right there. Randall treated the HOA like he was the mayor of a private city instead of the unpaid volunteer leader of a suburban committee. He walked around during neighborhood meetings with printed violation reports tucked under his arm like trophies. The weird thing was that Randall didn't even try hiding his favoritism. Some houses got warnings over tiny issues, while others blatantly violated major regulations without consequences. One board member stored an RV in plain sight for almost a year, despite the rules banning oversized vehicles entirely. Another had dead landscaping covering half their yard while residents were getting fined over weeds smaller than coins. That's exactly how power structures collapse eventually. The rules stop being about fairness and start becoming tools for selective punishment. For the first year, I mostly stayed invisible. I worked remotely, kept to myself, and avoided HOA meetings because every single one turned into middle-aged people arguing about nonsense For 3 straight hours, one meeting nearly devolved into screaming over whether wind chimes counted as unapproved noise-generating decorative installation. 4, bro. Hearing grown adults debate wind chimes like international diplomats negotiating peace treaties was unreal. Then everything changed because of my garage. And see, I own a restored 1969 Mustang Fastback. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, just a classic car I'd spent years rebuilding with my father before he passed away. I kept it inside the garage under a protective cover most of the time. Occasionally, on weekends, I'd pull it out, wash it in the driveway, and spend a few hours working on small maintenance projects. Perfectly normal hobby stuff. Apparently, Randall hated it. I found that out after receiving my first official violation notice claiming I was operating an unauthorized vehicle repair business within residential zoning limits. I genuinely laughed when I read it because it sounded ridiculous. There were no customers, no business signs, no excessive noise, nothing remotely commercial happening. I was changing spark plugs in my own garage, but according to the HOA, any visible mechanical activity exceeding recreational norms could qualify as prohibited commercial conduct. That phrase alone told me these people were dangerous. Exceeding recreational norms can mean literally anything depending on who interprets it. I appealed the violation immediately and attended the next HOA hearing expecting common sense to prevail. Huge mistake. The hearing wasn't a neutral review process at all. It felt like walking into a courtroom where the judge, jury, and prosecutor were all best friends. Randall sat at the center of the board table with his smug little smile, while another board member read my violation summary aloud like I'd committed actual crimes. And then they started showing photographs. At 5, they had printed pictures of my garage taken from the street over several weekends. Close-up images, time-stamped images, photos zoomed tightly enough to identify tools sitting on my workbench. Bro, hearing this still blows my mind because imagine realizing your HOA president has basically been conducting surveillance operations over a hobby car. I explained everything calmly. The car was personal property. No business activity existed. No repairs violated city ordinances. I even brought documentation proving the vehicle was registered as a collector. Automobile under state law, none of it mattered. Randall interrupted constantly, reframing everything I said into evidence supporting their narrative. And then came the fines, $500 initially, then another $1,000 after they claimed continued noncompliance. Then weekly penalties started stacking automatically. Every weekend I opened my garage, another violation appeared. Every time I washed the car, another complaint surfaced. Suddenly I was receiving notices for unrelated things too. Trash bins allegedly visible from the curb, improper edging near my flower beds, a mailbox scratch I could barely see unless sunlight hit it perfectly. That's exactly how harassment campaigns work in neighborhoods like this. They overwhelm you with constant pressure until you either surrender or move away. I tried reasoning with neighbors, and that's when I realized how deep the fear went. Several residents quietly admitted they thought the HOA targeted people unfairly. But nobody wanted to speak publicly because Randall retaliated against criticism. One family had been fined repeatedly after questioning budget expenses during a meeting. Another homeowner suddenly started receiving inspection notices every week after refusing to approve a dues increase. People weren't just annoyed with the HOA, they were scared of it. 6 then, one afternoon, an older neighbor named Mr. Holloway stopped me while I was checking the mail. He looked around before speaking quietly, like we were exchanging classified information in some spy movie. He told me Randall had been rewriting enforcement procedures for years, slipping amendments into meeting agendas nobody read carefully, tiny wording changes, expanded definitions, broader enforcement authority, hidden fee multipliers. Most residents ignored the paperwork because HOA documents are mind-numbingly boring, but Randall apparently studied them obsessively. Then Mr. Holloway said something that completely changed the direction of everything. He told me the bylaws contained a clause requiring the HOA to enforce every regulation equally across every property without selective discretion. If unequal enforcement could be proven, all penalties connected to that category of violations became legally invalid under the association charter itself. That was the moment the entire situation stopped being frustrating and started becoming interesting. Because if there was one thing Maple Ridge Estates definitely did not have, it was equal enforcement. And once I started reading the bylaws carefully for myself, I realized Randall and the HOA board had accidentally handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy their entire system from the inside. The next few weeks completely changed the way I looked at the neighborhood. Before that conversation with Mr. Holloway, I had still been treating the HOA like an annoying bureaucracy run by power-hungry retirees. After reading the bylaws myself, I realized Maple Ridge Estates was operating more like a rigged machine held together by intimidation and selective enforcement. And once you notice something like that, you can unsee it. 7. I printed the entire HOA handbook and started highlighting everything, every clause, every amendment, every enforcement standard. Bro, this document was a disaster. The rules contradicted each other constantly because Randall had spent years stacking amendments on top of older provisions without properly replacing them. Some sections still referenced policies from over a decade earlier. Others gave the board authority they legally shouldn't have had under state HOA regulations. That was incredible to me because nobody on the board seemed to realize their own paperwork could destroy them. Then I found the section Mr. Holloway mentioned. Buried deep inside the enforcement procedures was a clause stating that all community standards, restrictions, penalties, and corrective actions shall be uniformly applied without prejudice, favoritism, selective targeting, or discretionary inconsistency among residents. It sounded harmless at first glance, but legally it was devastating. That single sentence meant the HOA could not punish one homeowner for violations they ignored elsewhere, and Maple Ridge was overflowing with ignored violations. Once I started paying attention, the neighborhood looked completely different. Cars parked overnight in prohibited zones, basketball hoops left permanently visible despite rules banning temporary recreational structures, decorative lights installed outside approved seasons, landscaping violations everywhere. One board member even had a visible backyard shed that technically violated 3 separate architectural restrictions. That's exactly how people act when they believe rules only apply to other people. So I began documenting everything, not secretly, not illegally, just carefully. Every morning during walks, I photograph violations visible from public streets. Every evening, I cross-reference them against HOA regulations. I created folders organized by address, violation category, and enforcement inconsistency. Within 2 weeks, I had collected hundreds of examples proving the HOA selectively enforced rules almost entirely based on personal relationships. And the craziest part, Randall's own house was one of the biggest violations in the entire neighborhood. His driveway extension exceeded approved dimensions under Section 4.2 of the Architectural Guidelines. His backyard gazebo lacked recorded approval permits. His garage door color technically violated the approved exterior. Pallet listed in Amendment 11C. Bro, hearing this blew my mind because the guy enforcing microscopic mailbox scratches couldn't even comply with his own regulations. At first, I considered taking everything directly to court, but then I attended another HOA meeting, and something happened that completely shifted my strategy. A young couple stood up during the resident concerns portion and questioned recent increases in landscaping fees. Nothing aggressive, nothing disrespectful. They simply asked for financial transparency because community maintenance quality had noticeably declined despite rising dues. Randall absolutely lost it. He cut them off repeatedly, accused them of disruptive conduct, and threatened legal action for defamation against the board. You could literally feel the fear spread through the room. Nobody challenged him. Nobody defended the couple. People just stared downward, waiting for the meeting to end. That was the moment I realized this was bigger than my fines. This entire neighborhood had been conditioned into silence. And honestly, that's exactly how abusive systems survive. Not because they're powerful, but because most people decide fighting back is too exhausting. 9. So instead of hiring a lawyer immediately, I decided to use Randall's own system against him first. I began filing formal violation complaints. Lots of them. Every single complaint followed official HOA reporting procedures exactly as written in the bylaws. Proper formatting, supporting photographs, time-stamped evidence, relevant rule citations. I submitted violations against board members, committee members, and residents who had openly supported selective enforcement for years. The HOA office started drowning in paperwork. At first, Randall ignored the complaints completely. Huge mistake, because according to the bylaws, failure to investigate reported violations within 30 days constituted selective enforcement negligence. That meant every ignored complaint became additional evidence against the HOA itself. So I kept going. More reports, more evidence, more documentation. Bro, it became unbelievable once residents realized somebody was finally challenging the board. People started quietly helping me. Anonymous envelopes appeared in my mailbox containing old violation notices, photographs, meeting transcripts, and financial records. One neighbor gave me copies of emails proving Randall personally instructed inspectors to monitor difficult residents more aggressively. That was incredible because suddenly the entire illusion of HOA authority started cracking apart. And then came the $1 million fine. Apparently, Randall decided intimidation was still his best strategy. During a closed board session, they voted to classify my continued harassment of the association as intentional financial sabotage against property values. Using stacked penalties, legal fee estimates, projected damages, and emergency assessments, they generated a demand letter claiming I now owed the HOA over $1 million. $1 million, and over complaint forms, 10 bro. When that certified letter arrived, I actually sat there laughing for almost 5 straight minutes because the amount was so absurd it crossed into parody. But underneath the humor was something else. Randall was panicking because people only overreact like that when they know control is slipping away. And what Randall didn't realize yet was that I had already uncovered the one HOA rule capable of shutting down the entire neighborhood permanently. The rule was hidden inside a section almost nobody ever read because it dealt with emergency governance procedures and financial liability protections. Buried beneath pages of legal jargon was a clause stating that if the HOA engaged in provable selective enforcement, resulting in unlawful financial damages against residents, all active enforcement authority had to be suspended pending independent community review. Not reduced, not limited, suspended completely. Bro, when I realized what that meant, everything clicked instantly. If I could prove selective enforcement officially, the HOA would lose the power to issue fines, collect penalties, approve restrictions, or enforce neighborhood regulations until the investigation concluded. Randall had spent years building his little empire around controlling people through violations and fees, and now his own bylaws contained the self-destruct button. So I triggered it. I filed a formal petition supported by over 400 documented violations across the neighborhood, complete with timestamps, ignored complaint records, internal emails, and comparative enforcement histories. I included evidence showing residents were punished differently for identical violations depending on their relationship with the board. Then I sent copies not only to the HOA, but also to every homeowner in Maple Ridge Estates. That was incredible because panic spread through the neighborhood almost overnight. 11 residents who had stayed silent for years suddenly started demanding answers. Emergency meetings turned into chaos. People shouted over financial misconduct, intimidation, hidden legal settlements, and selective targeting. Randall tried controlling the situation, but the documents were too detailed, too organized, too undeniable. And then the state oversight office got involved. Within weeks, the HOA's enforcement powers were frozen, pending investigation. Fines became unenforceable. Collection actions stopped immediately. Several board members resigned before audits even began. And the best part, the $1 million fine they tried using to scare me became the exact piece of evidence investigators used to justify dismantling the board's authority in the first place. Once the HOA lost enforcement authority, Maple Ridge Estates changed almost immediately. And honestly, the weirdest part was realizing the neighborhood didn't collapse the way Randall always claimed it would. The grass didn't suddenly grow 6 feet high. Property values didn't implode overnight. People didn't turn their front yards into junkyards. In fact, most residents kept maintaining their homes exactly the same as before, because normal people generally take care of places they live without needing threats taped to their doors. That's exactly how fear-based leadership works. It convinces everyone disaster would happen. The second control disappears, even when the control itself was the real problem all along. 12. The state investigation lasted months. Financial audits uncovered years of questionable spending hidden inside vague administrative enforcement costs. Several board-approved legal contracts turned out to involve companies connected to Randall's relatives. Bro, hearing that part blew my mind because it explained why the HOA constantly escalated tiny disputes into expensive legal threats. The fines weren't about community standards anymore. They had become a revenue stream. Randall resigned before investigators completed their final report. According to rumors floating around the neighborhood, he tried selling his house quietly before formal findings became public. That was incredible because the guy who spent years obsessing over everyone else's property values ended up damaging his own reputation so badly he practically disappeared overnight. As for me, the $1 million fine was officially voided along with every related penalty. Residents who had paid questionable enforcement fees over the years eventually organized a class action recovery effort against the former board leadership and the Mustang. Ironically, after everything ended, people in the neighborhood started waving whenever I worked on it in the driveway. Some even brought lawn chairs over during weekends just to hang out and watch the restoration process continue peacefully. For the first time in years, 13 bro, stories like this are wild because they show exactly what happens when small amounts of power go unchecked for too long. That HOA honestly believed nobody would ever read the rules closely enough to challenge them. And that's how people like Randall usually operate. They depend on exhaustion, fear, and silence more than actual authority. But the craziest part is that the entire system collapsed because of its own bylaws. That was incredible to me. The same rules they used to control residents became the thing that destroyed their control completely. Honestly, that's one of the most satisfying revenge stories imaginable. If this HOA revenge story blew your mind, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us the craziest neighborhood drama you've ever seen. And honestly, after hearing this story, always read the fine print before signing anything involving an HOA. More insane revenge stories are coming next.